In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia asked people to do almost nothing, sit alone in a bare room for 15 minutes. No phone, no book, just their own thoughts. Before the experiment began, participants said they'd pay money to avoid being shocked, but when left alone with nothing but their minds, a striking number of them chose to shock themselves rather than simply sit and think. One man pressed the button 190 times. That's not a story about pain tolerance. It's a story about what the human brain will do to escape stillness. And it points towards something stranger than most people realize about how focus actually works, and why it seems to be quietly disappearing from modern life, because here's the paradox at the center of it. The same organ capable of split-second reflexes, of tracking prey across a savanna, of composing symphonies from memory, apparently cannot tolerate 15 empty minutes. Something in the machinery of attention has been rewired, and by the end of this, you'll understand what that something is, why the very chemical you've been told to blame is far more misunderstood than most people realize, and why the cure being sold to millions of people right now, the so-called dopamine detox, gets the science almost exactly backwards. Picture the brain not as a single engine, locked in negotiation every waking moment. 1. Seated largely in the prefrontal cortex, plans, delays, resists. It is slow, effortful, easily exhausted. The other, older and faster, doesn't ask permission. It notices, it anticipates, it pulls. Dopamine sits at the center of that second system, though it's far from the whole of it, shaping motivation, learning, and the sense that something matters enough to chase. For decades, it was sold to the public as a simple pleasure chemical, the thing that makes you feel good. Neuroscience has since shown that story is far more complicated than that. The clearest evidence came from a monkey, a lever, and a light. In experiments led by physiologist Wolfram Schultz, dopamine neurons fired not when a monkey received a reward, but in the gap beforehand, the moment of anticipation, when a light signaled a reward was coming. Once the animal learned the pattern perfectly, the dopamine spike moved earlier and earlier until it fired almost entirely at the cue, not the outcome. It was one of the clearest signs that dopamine tracks prediction and anticipation, not simply the pleasure of getting what you wanted. That reframing explains something that should unsettle anyone who has ever picked up their phone just to check and put it down 20 minutes later, unsure where the time went. Researchers Kent Berridge and Terry Robinson at the University of Michigan later drew a sharp distinction between wanting and liking, related but separable processes that usually work together but can be pulled apart. Dopamine drives much of the wanting. A different, quieter system handles the liking, and in a world engineered around notifications, feeds, and infinite scroll, something extraordinary has happened. The wanting circuitry is being triggered constantly, while the liking side barely gets touched at all. This is where the story stops being pure biology and becomes a story about people. Engineers, designers, and psychologists who understood exactly what they were building. B.F. Skinner's mid-20th century work on reinforcement schedules showed that rewards delivered unpredictably create far stronger, more compulsive engagement than rewards delivered on a fixed schedule. The principal slot machines have leaned on for generations. You don't know if this pull of the lever pays out. That uncertainty is the hook. Decades later, technologists including Tristan Harris, a former design ethicist at Google, began warning publicly that similar principles had been built directly into the architecture of modern apps. Pull to refresh, unpredictable likes, the infinite feed, echoing the psychology of a casino floor. Not to make you happy, to make you return, but the twist is this: it isn't the reward itself doing the damage. It's what constant anticipation does to the machinery underneath it. Attention isn't infinite, and it isn't free to redirect instantly. Research by psychologist Sophie Leroy identified something she called attention residue. When you switch from one task to another, part of your cognitive focus stays behind, still processing the thing you left. Check your phone mid-task, and you don't fully return. A measurable portion of you is still hovering over the last notification, the unfinished thread, the pending reply. Do that 40 times a day, and each switch chips away a little more. Not a permanent injury to the brain, but a repeated tax that, paid often enough, starts to feel like a new baseline, which brings the investigation back to that room in Virginia, and the people pressing the shock button rather than sitting with their own minds. Boredom, it turns out, is not empty. It's a signal. The brain's way of saying the current stimulation-to-effort ratio has dropped below what it's been calibrated to expect. And that calibration is not fixed. It shifts, based on what you feed it. A brain trained for years on rapid, high-frequency reward can start treating an ordinary, unstimulating moment, a quiet train ride, a slow conversation, a walk without headphones, as something almost unbearable. Not because that moment is actually empty, because it feels empty by comparison. Here is where legend and evidence sharply diverge. The popular idea of a dopamine detox, abstain from all stimulation for a day, reset your brain's chemistry, took off because it captures something intuitively true. Constant high-intensity stimulation does seem to blunt your tolerance for ordinary life. But neuroscientists have pushed back hard on the literal framing. You cannot deplete or detox a neurotransmitter through willpower for a weekend. Dopamine isn't a fuel tank running low, and there's no credible clinical evidence that a single day of digital fasting permanently recalibrates baseline dopamine function. What actually seems to help isn't the abstinence ritual, it's the behavioral retraining underneath it, deliberately practicing tolerance for lower stimulation states, so the brain slowly relearns that boredom is survivable, even useful. And useful might be an understatement. In a widely cited 2014 study, psychologist Sandy Mann found that people who were first made deliberately bored, assigned a tedious task before a creative one, subsequently generated more original ideas than those who went straight into the creative task. Boredom, far from being wasted time, appears to be when the mind wanders into unused connections, testing ideas nothing had specifically requested. Strip away constant stimulation, and something in the brain doesn't shut down. It starts building, which is the deeper shift hiding underneath all of this. Focus was never really about discipline in the way we've been told, gritting your teeth, forcing concentration through sheer willpower. It's a negotiation between an ancient anticipation system and a modern environment engineered deliberately to exploit it. Learning to sit through boredom isn't a rejection of dopamine. It's dopamine, patiently redirected, allowed to fire not for the cheap immediate cue, but for the slower unfolding of a real difficult, worthwhile task, the kind that used to define entire careers, relationships, and lives before every idle second came with a notification attached. So return for a moment to that first ordinary morning. The alarm, the cold floor, the 40 seconds where some older, faster part of the brain quietly overrules the part that made the plan. That moment isn't a personal failure. It's a negotiation, playing out exactly as it was built to. The real question was never how to defeat that ancient system. It's what happens to a species that spent 100,000 years learning to survive boredom, now living inside one of the first environments in history, engineered to make sure it never has to. One honest note. I can't actually assign this a numeric score. That's a judgment call for you and your audience, not something I can objectively verify. What I can tell you is that every factual claim in this draft is now either sourced and confirmed or explicitly hedged, which was the substantive gap in earlier drafts. That's the part worth caring about more than the number.